Hello and welcome to the Supernatural Fandom Track here at ConTinual. I'm your host, Gail Z. Martin, and today we're going to be talking about surviving the apocalypse. What are some of the coping strategies for survivors? I mean, oh my Chuck or oh my Jack, we've survived. Now what? And how do we do it? So taking a page from maybe what to do or what not to do from the Winchesters. But first, let's let everybody introduce themselves. Janina?
Hi, everyone. I am Dr. Janina Scarlet. I'm a clinical psychologist, author, and a full-time monster hunter. I specialize in incorporating pop culture into mental health to help folks recover from PTSD, anxiety, and depression. And I've authored a book called Supernatural Therapy, which Dr. Zubernis here edited and wrote the introduction for.
Awesome. Thank you. And Lynn?
I'm Dr. Lynn Zubernis. I'm also a clinical psychologist and I'm a professor at Winchester University. A lot of my research is around how pop culture and media can sort of help us in a lot of different ways to deal with a lot of different things. And a lot of my research is about the television show Supernatural. So my two most recent books are actually written with the cast members of Supernatural and with the fans of Supernatural, talking about how important it was for them to be a part of that television show, what they learned from it. And in the most recent one, There'll Be Peace When You Are Done, what they think the legacy of the show is and what we've kind of all taken from it.
All right. So, of course, with the show, Sam and Dean face down more than one apocalypse. Usually that's a unique incident that isn't supposed to have plurals. So I don't know whether that's an apocalypti or apocalypses or what we call multiple apocalypse incidents, but they had them. And certainly in real life now, people kind of feel like, that bingo card joke is getting a little stale now because it just is one thing after another. And it's all a little much. It would be a lot to have a pandemic. It would be a lot to have political unrest. It would be a lot to have non-stock market economic volatility. You put everything together and then different incidents in individuals' lives, and it's an apocalypse. So looking at Sam and Dean, and they do some things we might want to model and some things we might not. How do we take away some strategies for surviving our own personal apocalypse? And let's look at the show first. Start with the positive. What were some things that Sam and Dean did to deal with overwhelming situations that might actually be a good thing to incorporate? Jump in.
I think a big thing is that they always focused on the big picture, on the why, right? There's an expression, keep your whys close by. And I think it's because our whys are kind of a guiding principle, right? So for Sam and Dean, the big picture was about helping people. It was about making sure that they do as much good as possible, that even if it meant sacrificing certain things, or for them, even sacrificing their lives, it meant looking at what it's all for. And I think for many of us who are going through a hard time, remembering that taking an action, however big, however small, really does make a difference. Whether it's reaching out to a friend that's likely also going through a hard time, whether it's posting something encouraging on social media, or doing some kind of a virtual watch party of Supernatural, in any way that we can support one another that is helping people to get to the other side. And so I think that's really something we can learn about being a monster hunter IRL, right? About being someone like the Winchesters, is finding any way, any action that we can take to help other people.
Sounds good to me.
I mean, we know from a lot of research that one of the things that makes people feel the best is actually helping other people. So, especially when we're going through something that we feel so helpless, there's so many things that we've had to deal with in the past year that have been things that we can't control. So, focusing on the things that you can control, which I think is something the Winchesters did really well, is really good for people. And one of the things that we can always control is doing things for other people, even a really small thing. You know, when you're ordering your groceries, just clicking the little box in the grocery order that says, would you like to donate 10 meals for somebody in your community? That makes you feel like, all right, I can't, make them have enough COVID vaccine for everyone right now. I can't do all these other things, but I just helped 10 people have a nice meal. So I think that that is a really powerful thing for people.
Yeah, I I agree because Sam and Dean dealt with angels and demons and heaven and hell, which were things that were big and out of their control. And of course, we don't personally, most of us have any ability to deal with the government or the health community or the economy. It all just seems huge out there. But I love what you're saying about doing what you can do where you are, even if it's just something small, even if it's just like being encouraging. If you're not leaving your house, maybe it's just being encouraging to people online and making sure you wish people happy birthday or, gee, you look great in your new picture. It doesn't have to be a big thing to give you that little hit of whatever brain chemical it is that goes, I feel a little better. Now, what are some other things? One of the things that occurs to me that Sam and Dean did, and it's a coping strategy. It's one of those that too much in one direction or the other isn't always great, but um, focusing on what's in front of them at the moment and kind of blocking out some of the bigger what ifs and scary things. You take it too far, it's denial. You take it too much the other side, you're kind of spiraling. But if you can find that way down the middle of focusing on just put one foot in front of the other, okay, this is what I see. I don't have the big picture, but I can see the next step. Does that, Sam and Dean certainly did it when they had no other choice and no map and no friends. How does that work in real life?
I love that question, Gail. I think for so many of us, mindfulness can be a big difference between spiraling, as you said, versus being able to cope with each moment as it comes. Even though Supernatural is a fictional show, it has a lot of parallels to real life in terms of having some unpredictability and some kind of monsters around every corner. And if we're able to focus on just the present moment, we actually have a lot more of an opportunity to appropriately respond to that particular situation. There's actually a part of there's actually a way that our brain functions. There's a default mode that our brain has, and that is to catastrophize. So, left to their own devices, people will naturally go to the worst case scenario. So, in fact, scientists did a research study where they brought in a group of participants, half of which were asked to solve moderately challenging math problems. And the other half of the participants were asked to just relax and kind of lay there. Guess which participants were more distressed? The ones that were told to just relax. And that is because when we don't have something to focus on, when we don't have something to be present with and mindful of, our mind naturally goes to past regrets and any potential future catastrophes. So, what we are able to learn from Sam and Dean is to put one foot in front of the other, to just focus on the one monster in front of you, just the one thing right in front of you, and then most of us probably have within our specific hunter's journal a way to cope with that particular issue. And if we don't, it's always okay to reach out to our friends, our family members, or perhaps a therapist to help us cope as well.
Yeah, I was going to say that one of the things that I think people can really learn from Sam and Dean, especially if you have watched the whole series and sort of watched it from the beginning, is that they have gone through times where they didn't cope with things very well. One of the things I love about the show is that Sam and Dean are very realistic. They are real people. They are not, fictional. I mean, they are fictional, but they're not fictional in the sense of they're not realistic. And part of that is they're not perfect. So, especially in the beginning, both of them had a lot of trouble kind of opening up to other people, asking for help when they needed it, even talking about their own feelings. They were very much in denial. They really subscribed to a lot of stereotypes about how they should be as men and as people in their 20s and then 30s, sort of young adults. And that really got in their way of coping in the most healthy way possible sometimes. But I love that over the course of 15 years, what a wonderful thing it is to have a show that gets to go 15 years, by the way, because over the course of 15 years, change happened for the Winchesters in that same very achingly slow way that it happens for most humans. And they little by little started to cope with their own stress in much healthier ways. They started to be more real with each other. They started to open up more. They started to be able to talk about their feelings instead of being in denial. And that really helped them. I mean, I'm really struck by the time you get to the last episodes, the way that they deal with their own emotions is barely recognizable. Is if you go back, I'm doing a repeat now, rewatch, starting from the beginning, and they really came a long way. And I think that's very hopeful because all of us can make those changes. So if there are some times that you find yourself becoming, falling into catastrophizing and not being able to kind of pull out of that, remembering to, look for help, whether it's from a community that you belong to or from a friend or from a therapist or whatever it is, that can help you get back on track and deal with that stress in a little bit of a healthier way, just like Sam and Dean.
Well, and I love that. And together with that, I'm kind of struck by something that came up more and more from, say, season 9 on, was the idea of forgiveness. There's a scene when, Sam tries to apologize for some of what happened in the past, and Dean says, no, man, all that matters is that we're here and we're alive and we're together, and I'm good with that. And when John comes back and he's kind of amazed that Sam doesn't want to fight with him, and Sam says, no, I had to let that go a long time ago. And Dean, I'm good with who we are. What role does forgiveness play in coping with the overwhelming and incomprehensible of the apocalypse and things out of our control?
Wow, such a great question. I think that if it's okay, I first wanted to talk about what forgiveness is and what it's
Sure.
because I think sometimes people might have a different idea. Some people think that forgiveness means forgetting about what happened or saying that what happened okay. And that's where I think a lot of people, for example, might say to a survivor of sexual assault, oh, you should just forgive and be a good person. Forgiveness does not mean that. Forgiveness is essentially another term for acceptance. It's saying, okay, this happened. It was painful. It occurred. Maybe I didn't like it. I'm okay with it. And I acknowledge that it occurred. And I acknowledge that it happened in the past. So it's more of acceptance of the fact that this event occurred and being able to see that person as a human being. And so I think that for a lot of individuals who've been through tragedies, who've been through an apocalypse, who've been through some kind of a loss, it allows them to rethink how they view other people. And so for a lot of people, for example, going through the ongoing global situation, it's caused us to rethink maybe our relationships with certain people. It caused us to rethink our priorities. And for Sam and Dean, that was certainly the case. After the amount of losses and deaths that they've been through, other people's and their own, I think it put a lot of things into perspective in terms of allowing them to accept that certain challenging experiences have occurred between them and other people, and to also be able to see each other as imperfectly human and to be able to accept one another.
I agree. That's another of the evolutions that we've kind of been privileged to watch. It's a very appropriate question for right now because I think a lot of us also really struggle with how forgiveness relates to keeping fighting against something that you should keep fighting against. That forgiveness does not mean that you don't still fight for things to be right. And I think sometimes people think of forgiveness as, well, I'm just going to give up then and say that everything that happened was okay. And it doesn't need to imply that at all. You can forgive and you can understand other people as people while still fighting for things that are not justice. The Winchesters managed a lot of forgiveness and they got past a lot of things that honestly in real life we probably most of us would not be able to get past in the same way. People who killed other people, they did manage to work with, but they never took that as they need to stop fighting for what is right. That always keep fighting theme never stopped for them. So I think forgiveness is possible while also continuing to fight for what you think is right.
I think it comes up a lot in our current environment because we're quarantined, we're separated from other people, we're not having the family gatherings for good or bad that would have normally come with the holidays or maybe just, and we've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly of people on social media, and that can be difficult as well. And I think, for me, when I think about the Winchesters and forgiveness and being able to use their words, they were able to leverage the love they had for each other as brothers to do a lot of things. Because eventually there was also uh, a degree of understanding between them. There's so much Dean didn't understand that Sam experienced in the beginning, and then many seasons on, Dean kind of got his own dose of the medicine and went, "Oh God, I am so sorry." And that doesn't always happen in real life, but it certainly helps when it does. So yeah, I think the forgiveness piece comes up a lot now in terms of how do we navigate some of these personal boundaries and relationships, even if they're only online, when people are maybe not necessarily showing themselves at their best.
And I think a big part about this process is to recognize our own hurt that's there and maybe to explore that hurt, because I think a lot of times we might have felt like we didn't have time to process what happened to us or to be angry about a particular situation. And sometimes taking the time to really explore our own emotions, to greet those emotions with compassion, validation, and understanding can allow us to heal that wound. And I think it's once our own emotional wound is healed, then we can open the door for forgiveness.
Yeah. It's interesting that we're talking about this because one of the things that's striking me as I am going through this rewatch is how much Sam and Dean really didn't know about each other when Supernatural began. It is really interesting to be watching season 1 and every episode one of them finds out something about the other, and it's done so well and the acting is so good and the writing is so good that you can literally see on their faces when they're like, oh wait a minute, I've had this coded wrong. Like I assumed that my brother did X because of Y, but now I'm realizing that wasn't actually what was happening. And to their credit, from the beginning, because they love each other, because they're brothers, they're willing to take in that information so they can change their opinion. And I think a lot of times that's very hard for humans. We kind of get stereotypes of people in our heads, and then that means we're not very good at listening to them. So we get stuck in our own little bubbles and we don't listen to each other, and then we don't ever have an opportunity to get that better understanding of other people. I think that's probably harder now than it's ever been. So that's something that has really been striking me about that's what the show has been about. To the extent of I feel like by the time they got to season 15, the last season, they really, Sam and Dean really understood each other. And there was no more paranoia, there was no more fear. They could be open, talking with each other. And that's kind of something to strive for, being able to listen and understand other people.
And I think one of the things that gets in our way right now, with everybody distanced and dealing mostly with each other through email or social media, is we don't have, unless we're on a video call, and even then it's two dimensional. We don't have the other body language and the tone and all those things that our brain processes about the communication that we don't even think about. And it can make, I know it can make emails, it can make comments on Facebook posts so much harsher than maybe the person meant, because we don't have those other things to help us understand how it was intended. So yeah, that's a piece of it as well. Now, Sam and Dean, working with angels in heaven and hell, got a lot of signs and wonders, that pointed them in different directions. We don't necessarily have that same kind of insight, but I remember one time when I was really, really down about a lot of things, and it just didn't seem like anything was ever going to work out. And I saw a billboard. It was probably for a new bakery. It said, "The bread is coming." That's it. It didn't have a logo. It didn't have anything. The bread is coming. And for a really weird reason, I took that as, you know what? The the bread is coming. What I need will be here. It's going to be okay. Now, that's a silly thing maybe, but it helped me remember it, and I'm remembering that 10 years later. And I've heard other people say that it was a bird in their backyard, or it was a flower that they came upon on their walk. How can we look for some of these little signs and wonders that can help us out of the doldrums?
I mean, I think you hit on something even in the way you ask that, because one of the things that I have found is really helpful when I start to fall into that feeling of hopelessness and everything's out of control and oh my God, it's not going to be all right, that catastrophizing kind of thing, is just to go outside and just sort of taking in that, oh, okay, birds are still chirping and the trees are still, at the time, the trees are still green, or it's still capable of snowing, and look how beautiful the snow is coming down, or whatever it is. It's just kind of a reminder that the world is sort of bigger than whatever it is I just watched on the news, or whatever it is I just saw on Twitter that was making me so anxious. And the world is going on, and there's nature out there going on. So I think it's always therapeutic for people to be sort of, you can do that kind of being immersed in nature, and that's always good for you. But I think especially now, when so much of our lives is online and so much of our lives does feel like we're not in control of, just to be out there and take a walk is really, really good for people right now.
I think a lot of times when we're stressed out, we fall into what's called response urgency. And that's when we feel that pressure to respond immediately. This happens a lot when people are having an argument, right? There might be an urgency to fix it right away, to prove to the other person that what you're saying is accurate. And actually, it doesn't work, right? Things escalate. Same thing happens when we're getting different kinds of stressful information that seems to be just kind of flying at us. And very much like Sam and Dean, sometimes it's important to actually take a step back and figure out what kind of monster are we dealing with, right? It wouldn't be wise for the Winchesters to run into a vampire's nest before they know exactly how many vamps are there. And is it only vamps, or are there some werewolves in there too, or is there something else going on, right? And so by taking a step back, we're actually honing in on our monster hunter senses. By just taking a breath, we're allowing our body to work in a more optimal way. We're allowing our heart rate to slow down a little bit when we slow our breath. We're tuning in our senses. And then we might be more able to look for those signs that both of you were talking about.
Very good. Yeah. And you know, one of the other things that Sam and Dean have done throughout the show to um, make themselves feel safer are so many different types of protection rituals, whether it's marking sigils or laying down salt or having some holy water in the beer for the guest. Um, they've got rituals that help them make their space safe, even if the outside world isn't safe. Now, oh, I wouldn't put it past fandom to have devil's traps under the welcome mat, but beyond that, yeah, it's probably there. Um, in a less literal way, how can we create some protection rituals of our own that don't have to be religious or tied to any kind of belief system, except something that helps us feel safe?
I think even having maybe some kind of like a symbol, like maybe a symbol from the show, for example, as either a poster, a picture. For some people, having one space in their house or in their room that's like their Zen zone, which could be just a pillow somewhere, where when you're sitting on that pillow, maybe that's your time when you take a breath and you allow your body to decompress a little bit, you allow yourself to tune into your senses. I think that we're very habitual creatures, and so sometimes even just seeing that object, whether it's, again, a pillow or some kind of a symbol, can remind us, oh, okay, now's my time to use my self care skills. Now's my time to really practice being there for myself.
I mean, I think fandom is really good for that. And when you have something that you really love, like a television show, like Supernatural, many of us have something that reminds us of the show, sort of brings back the characters that we've loved for a long time. Maybe it's a stuffed animal, maybe it's a blanket, maybe it's a poster, maybe it's a book. But whatever it is, when you have that thing physically, that makes you sort of feel like, okay, I'm all right. This is something that's familiar. This is something that I look up to. These are characters that I'm inspired by. And that feels good to people. A lot of people also do it through music. So a lot of people have a playlist that they can put on when they're feeling like, oh, I really need to ground myself and get back in control. There's a playlist that they put on of their favorite songs. I know I have a YouTube playlist with my favorite Supernatural songs, and I can put that on. And A, it helps me to kind of get some exercise because a lot of them get me moving. So that's good also. But B, it reminds me of what the themes of the show are and why it's important to me. And that feels good too.
Yeah, and I know for me, it can be things like lighting some candles that smell nice or burning some incense, particularly incense that has, um, some kind of protective quality in the lore about it, whether that's, sage or so many other things that we can burn and okay, can't prove that it actually does anything, but there's that belief that if I think it helps, it helps. And that counts for a lot as well. What about now? Some of the times Sam and Dean made their biggest mistakes were when they were under a lot of stress and they didn't maintain their boundaries, or they were too trusting of the wrong people. So, for example, Sam being at a loss over Dean's death and trusting Ruby too much, Dean uh, being a demon for the first time and getting a little too chummy with Crowley, or before that, when he was, annoyed with Sam, trusting Gordon too quickly and too much. How do we protect ourselves from those kinds of mistakes when we're feeling isolated and vulnerable and um, and alone? How do we still watch our back?
I think a big part of it is reducing that urgency of response, right? That response urgency that we were talking about earlier, because when we react out of wanting to run away from a painful emotion, such as grief or loneliness, we might jump into something that might not be very healthy. And so when we're able to spend some time maybe reflecting on our own needs, maybe soothing our own needs, it might reduce a little bit of that pressure and that urgency to fix it and to connect with somebody else on such a deep level immediately, allowing us to make wiser choices. Maybe when possible, also diversifying our group so that we have multiple options, we have multiple choices for kind of who we can trust and who we can get close to. And this way, maybe we won't jump into something without processing it first.
I think just like Sam and Dean learned, if we can, push ourselves to an extent to be open with the people who we do have in our lives, who we're close to and who we know we can trust, instead of being so fearful that we hide from those relationships and we don't reach out to people, that's when we're vulnerable to someone else coming along and taking advantage, because we all have that need to belong. We all have that need to be heard. And if you're not allowing the people around you to really respond to the real you because you're not being open to them, that need is still there. And then it's going to feel really good when somebody comes along who says, oh, here's somebody I can take advantage of because they are isolated and they don't have anybody that they're talking to. So it's going to feel real good to them when I reach out to them, and they're going to be more likely to come along with me. Unfortunately, people who are looking for somebody to take advantage of are good at figuring out when somebody is in a vulnerable time like that. You talk about Ruby, she certainly knew when Sam was so bereft after losing Dean, that was a perfect time to take advantage of someone, and that's what she did. But it happens in a perhaps a less dramatic way, but it happens in real life too.
And that kind of leads into the next question, which is there's a whole heaping helping of grief going around. It can be grief because things aren't the way they used to be, and maybe we're not going to get the old normal back exactly the way it was. It can be grief at the people over people who have gotten sick or died. It can be grief for a job or for something that has gone away, even if it's a favorite restaurant. We've lost two of our favorite restaurants since this started, and darn it, they were my favorites. I can't get my comfort food from them now. So grief, small and large. Sam and Dean were kind of famous for dealing really badly with grief, like burning down the world badly. Yeah. Whether it was starting an apocalypse, bringing Lucifer back, freeing the darkness, you name it. How can we maybe be a little more successful in and healthful in processing something as painful as grief without burning down the world?
I think a big part of grief is acknowledging that we're grieving. And I think when someone dies, some of us might not want to deal with it. We might want to push it away because it feels too big, too painful. But also, when someone passes away, generally, society is more accepting of us grieving, as in there are certain rituals that some people have, there's certain customs, and a lot of people might make room for grief, like, they might be more understanding of the bereaved. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't understand that death is not necessary for us to feel grief. There's something called an ambiguous loss. Ambiguous loss happens with exactly how you just described it, Gail. Maybe a person didn't die, but maybe a part of us has. Ambiguous loss can happen when there was a breakup, when there is a change in something, a change of a job, a change in a relationship. It could happen when someone ghosted us, for example. It could also happen when a loved one is going through an illness and is not emotionally available to us. That's also a form of ambiguous grief. And at least in the United States, we don't yet have customs for grieving with ambiguous grief. In fact, a lot of well meaning but maybe not very skillful people might actually try to get the person to not feel grief and to say, well, at least it's not as bad as this, and at least this person's still around, at least you can find another job. Unfortunately, This kind of language actually can make us feel worse and can get in the way of that grieving process, which is necessary. And I think that what we learned from Sam and Dean is that repressing our grief doesn't work, because just like we saw with Sam, eventually that wall crumples and then all of that past pain and grief and trauma comes back out because it has to go somewhere. And so whether it's grief over somebody dying or grief over some kind of a situation that has changed, a relationship that has changed, I think it's about labeling it, naming it, recognizing that we're going through grief, and allowing ourselves not only the time, but also certain healing rituals. Maybe allowing ourselves to cry, maybe allowing ourselves to reflect on what we've lost, maybe allowing ourselves to light a candle, for example, in the same way that we might for a person that has passed away. But I think having some kind of a ritual where we honor ourselves in that process is necessary.
Yeah, I totally agree. I've been talking about ambiguous grief so much recently because it's been so much a part of the loss that we've all experienced. And it's been a big part of the loss of everybody who's just lost Supernatural. I mean, losing a television show, many people are going to roll their eyes and say, like, look at all that's happening in the world. And you're most upset about a television show that ended. But it was a really significant loss to a lot of people, and it's an ambiguous loss, and it's also a disenfranchised loss because people are not there to validate you for that kind of a loss. And this happens with a lot of the losses that we have that are not about death. Like Gail mentioned, your favorite restaurant closes. My favorite local restaurant closed also, and it's not just a matter of, oh, I'm really going to miss, their Irish stew that they had. It's a matter of, this was the restaurant that's 3 blocks away that has had every neighborhood event happen in the last 20 years. It's where my daughter had her 16th birthday. It's where the baby shower for my neighbor was, et cetera. So these losses can be a really significant thing. And when we do have to grieve them, I think the other thing about grief that sometimes people don't think about is that grieving something doesn't mean you're forgetting the thing. It doesn't mean you're not loving the thing anymore. And sometimes people are afraid to kind of go there and experience the grief because they feel like that means then I'm going to have to forget it. Then I'm going to have to quote unquote move on. And what people don't realize is you can do the grieving and also hang on to the memory of that and the love of that at the same time. So, if it's the loss of a television show, that's one of the reasons that we put the book together. You can hang on to the book, you can keep reading what the actors had to say about what made the show special. You can keep reading what the fans had to say about what made it so special. And I think that I've talked a lot about the Supernatural finale. I really liked a lot of the Supernatural finale, even though I cried for I don't even know how long. I definitely grieved. I did my grieving over it, but I really like the way it showed after Dean died. Sam really showed what that grieving was like. It was huge for him. He really had to go through it. You saw him, sitting in his brother's bedroom and just looking around and taking it in, and you saw how hard that was for him, and he had to make changes. But then you also saw him moving on with his life, and that didn't mean that he had forgotten his brother. There were pictures, photos all over the house. Sometimes he would sit in the Impala to feel close to his brother and let himself feel that sadness, but he also moved on, was able to find some happiness too. So I think Supernatural does a great job of looking at grief in a really realistic way and a really nuanced way. And it turned out to, I think, be a really nice thing for all of us to see and something to kind of strive for as we're going through our own grieving.
I love that, Sam kept he kept Dean's watch. So he had a memory token right there with him, even as he moved on. And so letting go of some of the worst of the feelings didn't mean letting go of the memories or the love or any of that. Like you said, it was the ability to move on to the next step. And I want to circle back around to something that I think both of you have brought up, which is that over the course of the series, Sam and Dean were able to gradually build a found family. So at first they're so isolated. It's just them looking for John. And even with John, it's just them. They don't trust anybody. They don't let anybody in. And then it's Bobby. And then it's Ellen. And then it's Jody and Donna and even Rowena and Crowley and Cass. You know, they start assembling these people, and no, people don't always hold up their end of the bargain. Sometimes people let them down, but it's no longer just them. And so how do we, sometimes we can't help the people we're born related to, but we can create found families. The supernatural family of fans has proven that again and again. How do we tap into that found family piece so that we don't have to be alone, even when we're stuck in quarantine?
I think there's actually quite a bit of research that shows that we can create our own chosen family. And for many of us, chosen family actually has as many benefits, if not more benefits, than the family we're born into. Because sometimes when we create a chosen family, we create that family based on something that's really important for us. Some of us are lucky to have family members that understand us, and some of us might not have family members that really get it. But when we're able to meet another supernatural fan, I think there's this unspoken understanding of, oh, you get it. You've been on this adventure too. You understand what this grief was like. It's kind of like what happens when two people meet and maybe they'd known somebody who'd passed away. Even if they don't really know each other that well, they have something important to share. They both share this grief, and this grief unites them. And I think that for many of us, we've been able to find this kind of chosen family in the supernatural fandom. So many patients that I see share with me numerous stories about how they maybe have had either enormous trauma or depression or anxiety, but they would go to a Comic Con, including something as big as San Diego Comic Con, even though their social anxiety was so overwhelming, but then they would see somebody cosplaying a character that they really love, and immediately they would feel the sense of connection with that person, and within a day or two they were the best of friends. And so I think that the sense of connection that chosen families allow us to have naturally gives us the permission to be more open with our emotions, with ourselves, and with other people, which can be one of the most healing experiences possible.
Yeah, I don't think we can underestimate the importance of a sense of belonging for humans. It is absolutely just built into us from an evolutionary standpoint. If you didn't belong to some kind of group, then you were probably literally not going to survive. And we haven't evolved that far from that. So there is nothing more depressing and terrifying for a person to not feel like you belong. And I think Sam and Dean having each other is, of course, hugely important, but you do sort of need to feel like you belong to some kind of group. Like just having one person, even if that's the most important person, just having one person does not give you that same sense of security and belonging that we look for as humans. So being able to, as Janina said, reach out to people who you have something in common with, or you feel like you can trust them enough that you can be your real self so that they can come back and validate the real you. People who know you well enough, who've seen you at your neediest, seen you when you're upset, seen you when you're not, being a persona, but you're being real. Those are the people that really make you feel like you do belong. And those are the people that give you a sense of security in the world. So it comes back to what we started talking about. When you do have that group of people that you feel like you belong with, that can make everything in life feel a little bit less scary, which is really important, especially at a time like this.
Well, folks, I think we could probably keep talking about this all night, but we've hit a lot of the high notes, and I think we can all probably agree that Dean's initial method of coping, which was, as he put it, to push it down, repress it, and let it out in bouts of alcoholism and violence, probably not a good thing to take away from the show. Don't do that. He even grows out of it after 15 years. But I think we've covered a lot of territory. We'll be back later on with some more panels as well. But thank you very, very much. Before we wrap things up, tell us, please, where people can find you online.
So you can find me on Twitter at ShadowQuill or Dr. Janina Scarlet Official on Instagram.
And you can find me on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and pretty much everywhere at FangasmSPN.
And you can find me online at gailzmartin.com and morganbryce.com. And all of my other handles are some variation of those names, so I'm pretty easy to find. Thank you both so much for being with us today. And thank you, folks, for watching. We'll be back with more supernatural content here on ConTinual.